Hello, everyone. I'm Catherine Anaya. Thank you so much for joining me for the Women's Eye podcast, where we introduce you to fascinating women who are leaving their mark, making a difference in changing lives. This episode is brought to you by Casco Financial Group, located in Phoenix, Arizona. Catherine Scrivano is the president of Casco Financial Group. She founded her business to help people create the financial strength needed for achieving their dreams and building money power. Her belief is you don't have to be wealthy to be wise. And Catherine is my guest today. Catherine, always a pleasure to see you.
Happy to see you as well.
Good to have you here. So, one of the lessons many families have discovered during this pandemic is that our children really do pay attention to what we say, what we do, and that's often true when it comes to money. So I want to talk today about kids and money. How soon should we start teaching our kids how to handle money wisely?
Personally, I think that as soon as they start showing an interest, I have a 5-year-old granddaughter, so I'm pegging a lot of things to her, thinking about this right now. But if you ask a 5-year-old where does money come from, they're going to tell you it comes from a machine. Am I right? They've seen
Yes.
mom and dad maybe put a debit card in somewhere. So the opportunity to start talking to them about money and about the influence and the choices that we make around money, as soon as the child starts showing an interest, that's the cue for the parents, I think.
And how should that conversation go? Do we automatically teach them that, we go to work, we earn money, that's where it comes from?
Well, it is a matter of modeling. I would hope that families do a great job about being open about money. I know that's not the model within every family. It was certainly not the model with which I was raised. And I've seen so many folks and families say, gee, if I'd only had information earlier. Often they tend to deflect and say, all the financial issues should be taught in school. And while I completely agree with that, guess what? Mom and dad are school right now. So here's your chance. If you weren't motivated before, maybe this is a tap on the shoulder saying now's the time to be teaching. One, through modeling, through being transparent with your kids about what you're doing. And the other is thoughtful, strategic lessons.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because I remember learning how to write a check at school in the 5th grade. But I noticed with my own kids, they don't really start learning about money in school until they're in high school. So it really does fall to us to start having those conversations early. Also, when it comes to giving an allowance, that's something that, not every family buys into, but most of the families I come across do give their children some kind of allowance. What is a good starting point for that?
Well, I agree with you. I think that's for most people their first financial lessons. I mean, that's a very broad statement, but in general, the reality of handling money comes from having an allowance. My first advice to parents would be talk about it and have a goal, have a strategy in place. Don't just randomly come up with, we need to start giving the kids an allowance. Think about what you're trying to accomplish and the opportunities for lessons along the way. And then you can kind of peg the allowance to the experience and the teaching that you want them to do.
Is there a certain time or a certain age when you should first introduce an allowance? And then, of course, begs the question of how much do you give?
I think that's all over the place. I've seen it tied to the child's age. $1 per year of age and things like that. Those boilerplate plans are a great starting point. But again, I think the families have to have the conversation about what are they trying to do by creating this income stream for the children. And is it something that they have to earn? In some families, they feel strongly that being a member of the family means you will pitch in and do chores. In others, they want to get the children used to the idea of providing a service and getting paid for that. So again, what is your goal? What's the end game? And then sometimes a compromise between those two extremes is the best result.
So if you were going to decide, do I offer an allowance, no strings attached, or do I offer an allowance based on, chores you do it around the house or what have you, that really comes down to the goals that you have in mind for that allowance, right?
Absolutely. And it doesn't have to be black or white. You might say that you expect your children to participate because they are members of this family, but give them the opportunity to earn a little extra. So things that may not necessarily be regularly assigned chores, if there's something that they're saving for, give them a chance to earn by doing extra things.
So let's say you opt into giving your child an allowance. What are some things to keep in mind when it comes to saving and spending, or short-term versus long-term goals? How do you go about weaving in those very valuable lessons that are going to help them so much later in life?
Isn't that interesting that we're talking about children right now? And this is the same conversation you and I have ongoing about setting goals, having a plan for reaching them, dividing them between short and long-term goals, needs, wants, and wishes. All of those concepts are something that a very young child can really grasp. One thing I would caution when you're talking to my 5-year-old granddaughter, long-term is the day after tomorrow.
Right.
So don't, you have to meet them where they are. But I think that, again, being strategic, my recommendation is, as you talk about creating an allowance and creating this financial education program for your kids, that you talk about what they want today, but force them to save. Just make that just an accepted part of the plan. Get them to, from a very early age, putting away some of their money. This circumstance that we are all sharing right now is a great opportunity to model success or failure based on having reserves, having had an emergency fund. I mean, this is the real thing. We've been in dress rehearsal. This is the live performance. And folks who are having less pain are those who had some kind of reserves. No judgment implied here, but that's the reality, is if there's been some money to fall back on, they're getting through this easier than someone who has spent their reserves within a couple of weeks.
Well, and those are the conversations that kids are hearing if they're at home being quarantined, or if they're, riding out this wave right now, just to wait and see for the next phase of what we're in. They are listening to these conversations, and it is a good opportunity for us as parents to open up that dialogue and explain, here's why we might be in a better situation because we did this, or here's why we're not in the best situation because we didn't do this.
Again, it comes back to the culture of the family. I was raised in a culture in which the financial information was not shared because we weren't to be worried. As kids, our job was to play, not to be concerned. But children still see the tension in their family, especially between couples, is often around money. They're picking that up anyway. So being proactive, making that part of the family conversation, you'll decide how much or how little detail to share. But I would certainly encourage you to make that part of the family conversation regardless.
Let's talk about teenagers for a moment. I took my son to open a teen checking account when he turned 13. How should we use that to teach good saving habits? The reason I did it at that time was because he was starting to get money for, Christmas and birthday. That's all they really want at that age. Sure. And you have to put it somewhere and understand about interest. And when you take it out, guess what? You see the number drop down, and you can visibly see, I don't have that much.
I think it's an important expectation, though, that the child will take money out sometimes. Otherwise, it feels like a bottomless pit to them. And again, depending on the age of the child, just having money go away is not a positive experience. So let them make withdrawals and see the result of the withdrawals. At some point, hopefully, we'll all start earning interest on our savings accounts again, and we'll be able to teach the benefits of receiving an interest payment. I'm a firm believer that I think 13 is a great age for kids to have their own banking experience. whether it's a local bank or credit union or an online relationship. A lot of financial institutions have programs geared to the younger savers. And there's an educational component and often some features that come with no fees. Obviously, they're trying to get the parents' business, but if you have a great relationship on behalf of your children, you're going to be willing to consider that institution for your own account. So take advantage of that.
Yes, it's worked well for us so far. What about when they reach a working age? So now they're making their own income. It's a great opportunity if we haven't already taught them about creating a balanced budget. What are
Exactly.
some key methods of teaching that?
Well, you know what? The first thing is a reality check. They're probably going to have Social Security and Medicare taxes withheld. And looking at their pay stub with them and explaining the
Gross versus
consequence
net.
of deduction. There's a concept that some people get well into adulthood before they really understand the control that they can take of their net pay by controlling withholding for taxes and a variety of things. So there's a great lesson right from the beginning. But creating that spending plan, just as in adulthood, is a matter of how much income is coming in, what are our expenses. And I promise you, I feel it so strongly that an expected expense will be saving, that you're just going to put money aside before you do anything else, hopefully. Also, if you're charitably inclined, I think it's wonderful to have children experience giving. There are programs where there is save, spend, and share are the three buckets. And the spend bucket is where you start saying, okay, how much are you going to spend on entertainment, or maybe you're expecting the children to start having experiences with buying their own clothing or shoes or covering some of the expenses parents have already done. But just creating that written plan, can't stress that enough, and then have them reevaluate or every month or so and see how they're doing and get the real experience, make adjustments as they go. These are the same things we do as adults, but having fewer things to keep track of and having mom and dad standing over your shoulder, encouraging you and giving you hints along the way. What a great start.
Well, it gives them so much independence too, which they probably may not realize right off the bat, but they tend to
Oh, they
realize
love
that
it.
eventually.
Yeah,
Yes,
they absolutely.
they
I
do.
want to share with you, families right now are looking for things to do to keep the kids entertained. I would encourage everyone to Google the Bean Game,
The
BEA
bean game.
Bean Game. And this is a very fun family activity in which you're going to download some grids that represent a typical family's household expenses. You're going to take 25, in our case, we always use beans, but you can use any similar tokens, and then decide how to spend your beans. Those beans represent the income. Those spreadsheets represent the choices that you make. And it helps also understand what's important and the consequence of certain decisions. For instance, if you choose to buy a car, guess what? Also on that grid are auto repairs, gasoline,
Uh-huh.
insurance, etc. So you may decide to take public transportation instead as a result. Um, Children tend to love pets. I'm an animal lover like crazy. I understand if I bring a pet into my home, I'm also talking about feeding them, grooming them, and paying veterinary bills.
Yes, it
Children
all adds up.
yeah, so the bean game is a great way to do it. It's a great family activity, and I think it communicates family values because the goal is to have consensus. Everybody contributes to the conversation and the decisions. I think it's a wonderful
I
exercise.
love that. I love it. And, talking about some of these more in-depth financial conversations, not that the bean game is not, but it gets the ball rolling. So when my daughter turned 18, that was when we started introducing her to investing money. You don't actually have to open an account to really teach those methods and teaching how the market works, right? I mean, you can do something similar to the bean game in that you can kind of follow along as if you had invested something, right?
Yeah, I think it's a great assignment to pretend that you're buying an investment and do the research, be able to explain your rationale, pretend that you've purchased it, and then watch the price and look for opportunities to buy more, look for clues to sell. And you're simply doing it on paper without actually opening an account, without having the experience. But you do get to have the thought process, the research process, and you also get to watch what fear and greed do to your bottom line. And in the real world, those are the two things that tend to trip us up most. We're fearful either of losing or of missing out.
Yes.
And sometimes we watch things are going really well and we think, okay, we should take our gains, but what if they get even better? Those emotions can get in the way of our success as adults. We can see it on paper with our kids, especially teenagers. I think it's just a wonderful thing. And no real consequence, no real life consequence.
Right. But being able to think through those decisions.
Yeah.
Speaking of big decisions, credit cards. Oh. So my husband, totally against credit cards, doesn't own one. I, on the other hand, do. And I had my daughter, had my son on my credit card so I could help them establish credit. What's the rule of thumb when it comes to introducing credit to children?
I think it's exactly, I applaud you, though I agree with your husband being independent and not having obligation to anybody. What could be better than that? However, in the real world, most people cannot pay cash for a car, cannot pay cash for a house. So a credit card may be a great way to have the experience of borrowing, shopping around for fees, looking at comparing rewards, and having the experience of paying more for something as a result of having used credit than the original purchase price. That's pretty painful as an adult. I'd love to see that pain transferred to a younger person where the money that we're talking about is probably a lower amount. An alternative might be either a prepaid card or a credit card that is secured by a bank account. So that they can have the experience. It feels pretty much the same, but without the dire consequences. And if you are going to be a co-signer on an account, you talked about putting your children on yours. Just be aware that you are fully responsible for everything they do. So hopefully you're monitoring, having conversations about the choices that they make. It's a great time to have conversations around being a good consumer. You can do that very young. When you go to the grocery store, maybe you're telling your kids why you're making the selection of this brand over another. You can do that with my 5-year-old granddaughter. But just getting them to be a little bit defensive about the influence of peer pressure and advertising might serve them well later as well.
Right. Well, I could talk about this for hours because it's such a very important topic, and one that I think families are finding very important now that we're all kind of confined together, have been confined together, and you know, it's the reality.
And it is such an emotional topic. And
it is.
As parents, just like having the birds and the bees talk, you have to step back and deal with facts, talk about our values. I mean, there's a lot of similarities between these two conversations, but they're probably not going to hear as much birds and the bees talk as they do money talk outside of the home.
Yes.
So be clear on, again, from the very beginning, be clear about what you're trying to accomplish, what the lesson is. And this is tough for a lot of us, but I encourage you to share your failures as well.
Yes.
Telling your kids, you know, I've had this experience. This was the choice that I made and the reasons I wouldn't make that choice again. You can avoid the pain. You can learn the lesson without experience.
Yes. And it's the biggest, best lesson when it comes from us, because we are living proof that you can get through it, but it was a very painful process in some situations.
One of the best fathers that I know almost never gives his son advice saying, this is what you should do. He approaches his son and say, I was faced with the same decision. let me tell you what I did so you can avoid the result that I went through.
Yes.
And his son is great about listening to him, sometimes saying, thanks, Dad, I'm doing it this way anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But very often saying, oh my goodness, that wouldn't have occurred to me.
Mm-hmm.
Off in a different way. And they have a wonderful relationship. They do this on great big issues, and they do it on some of the more routine financial issues. And I think it's a wonderful model. But we
Well,
have to
we
take
are,
our own emotions out of it and be willing
yes.
to admit we've made mistakes.
And they need to remember that we are smarter than they think.
Well, yeah, that's not that bars tends to be pretty low.
Yes,
If
I
we've got
know.
teenagers, I know. But I have teenage granddaughters as well, and watching them make some hard lessons around money. Sometimes they feel like, oh, gee, when I consider what my grandmother does for a living, I shouldn't make mistakes. But some of our better lessons come from our own bumps and bruises.
Yes. Well, I just love chatting with you, Catherine. Thank you so much. Great financial information as always. And thank you, of course, for being a regular contributor here on the Women's Eye podcast.
I'm
So
glad to
appreciate
do
you.
it.
You can learn more about Catherine on our website at thewomenseye.com. And please do not forget the Women's Eye has a book. It's called 20 Women Changemakers. You can find it at changemakersbook.com. And that's going to do it for this episode of the Women's Eye podcast. Thank you, Catherine, for joining me. And thank you for joining me here on the Women's Eye. I'm Catherine Anaya. Until next time, remember, it's the world as we see it.